Hi, my name is Sara Bennett. I'm a photographer and I live in Brooklyn, New York. And actually, it's only recently that I've started to actually call myself a photographer because unlike many of the people who you have come to visit your classes, I didn't start out as a photographer. I was a criminal defense attorney for almost 20 years, and then I had a second career as an anti-homework advocate. And then I picked up a case in New York State of a woman who had a sentence of 75 years to life in prison, meaning she was going to spend all of her 75 years in prison. And I was trying to figure out how to get clemency from the governor of the state of New York, which is sort of an extraordinary action that the governor can take. One day I just had this brainstorm that I was going to photograph women who had been in prison with her, talking about her influence on their lives. And so I picked up my husband's camera, actually. I hadn't taken photos probably for almost 30 years. And I had a bunch of women come over to my house and I took their portraits. And then I interviewed them about my client and her effect on them. And I put together a little book called Spirit on the Inside. And I sent it to the governor and I sent it to state legislators and I showed it to my family and friends. And eventually 2,000 copies of this book went out into the world. But it was the people who I showed it to, it was the reaction to this book that sort of set me down this path of photography, because people would look at the photos of the women who I had photographed and say, wow, she was in prison? What was she in prison for? She looks so ordinary. She looks like my neighbor. She looks like my grandmother. She looks like my aunt. She looks like my friend. And I was surprised. I probably shouldn't have been, but I realized that people had a pretty strong stereotype of what people are like who are in prison. And I wanted to show through photography the ordinariness and the regularness of people behind bars and get society to start thinking about, why do we lock people up and why do we lock people up for so much time? And so I started my first photography project, which was called Life After Life in Prison. And I started following 4 women through their reentry process. When you get a life sentence, you might get a sentence of something like 25 years to life. It means that you serve 25 years and then you go to the parole board. But often the parole board doesn't let you go. And so I was meeting people who had been spending 30, 35, even 40 years in prison, even though their original sentence was 25 years. So I kind of wanted to show what it was like to come back into society after serving that amount of time. And so I photographed 4 women, and the woman whose photographs you're seeing here is Evelyn, who had been out of prison for 2 years when I met her, and I just kind of followed her about in her day-to-day. I wasn't considering myself a photographer then either. I was just, had something I really wanted to say, and my background as a criminal defense attorney, I knew a lot about the issues of what was required in coming back into society, and I wanted to show it with a camera. And I interviewed Evelyn as we went along, as I did the other 3 women whose photos I'm not showing you today. And by the time I finished interviewing the 4 women, I was hoping that readers of the book that I put together called Life After Life in Prison, or at the exhibition, would get a really good sense of what it was like to be both in prison and coming out. And so things like what happens to your children when you go to prison, or what happens when a loved one dies when you go to prison, what kind of work do you do in prison? When you get home, how do you find housing? How do you find a job? What are the obstacles for finding a job? What's it like to be on parole? How do you report? So all of those things I interviewed the women about, and I was just getting to know them and being involved in their lives. And along the way, I started to grapple with some of the issues that I think all photographers do, which is, how close do you get to your clients? How much could I help them? I had a lot of skills that they didn't have: resume writing, how to navigate social services, what to do when they encountered discrimination. And so I set out to be sort of a photographer with some sense of remove, but as I got closer to them, I actually did get involved in their lives. And now 6 years later, I know them very well. I know their families. They know my family. They've been to my house. I've been to their house. I mean, I tried to share some of my life because I thought it was important, because I was asking them to share parts of their lives. As I was going along photographing them, they moved around a lot. And so I was photographing them in all their different bedrooms. At a certain point, actually, my husband's a photographer, and he said to me, you know, it looks like you have something interesting here with the bedrooms. You should photograph a lot of women, and you should photograph them all in their bedrooms and maybe put that together as a series. And I thought, that's a really great idea. And so that's how I came across this project, the Bedroom Project. One of the things that I hit upon at that point was I wanted to have the women's handwriting accompanying the photographs. And so as I was doing the Bedroom Project, I asked each woman, I showed them the photo I took of themselves. I said, when you see this photo of yourself, what do you think? Or what does it make you feel? And then I got handwritten statements from all of them. So this is what Tracy says. I imagined coming home, living in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, where one was my master and one was for my guest. Here I have that. I call this room my dollhouse, my safe haven. I feel at peace. I finally unpacked. I spend a lot of time in here. I take pride in everything. I put more into this room than into the kitchen. I know I need to eat, but my room is my nourishment. And then these are some of the items that are on Tracy's floor, and I asked her about them. And, you know, if I were in front of you, I'd ask you what you think of what you're seeing here, because I was so struck by the fact that this is a very small room, and these are her prized possessions. And it's things like Tide and Downy, things that a lot of us take for granted. But in prison, people are given a small bar of soap that has to last for a certain amount of time. And so actually being able to have a bunch of Tide or a lot of shoes or whatever was really important to her. So this is Karen. I met Karen the day before she was released from prison, and she had served 35 years. And I followed her, so I kind of added her to my Life After Life in Prison project. She was the 5th woman I added in. And she ended up in a homeless shelter. And so here you see her in the homeless shelter. And when you look at it here and you read what she writes, like how secure she feels in here and she's at peace and she's so happy to have her own space. What you don't know is that behind her outside there's a door frame, but there's no door, there's no curtain, there's nothing, is like a dorm-like setting with 5 other beds in it, which I was not allowed to photograph. And the first time I went to the shelter, they sent somebody up with me to photograph her, and I was given about 2 minutes, and so this was the result. But I ended up hanging around the shelter because I was photographing her so much, and many years later, I actually got to photograph that dorm setting that was right outside her room. So that sort of kind of shows, like, the longer you're around someplace, the more they forget about you or the more they trust you. I'm not sure which it is. But by the time I photographed Annette, they were just like, oh, just go upstairs, just do it, you know, go upstairs. And so Annette and I went upstairs, and I was like, oh, great, this is the photo I've always been wanting, because you get to see what's outside Karen's room. And then here's Karen 3 years later, and she's no longer living in the shelter. Now she lives in Brooklyn, and this is her room today. And I've sort of been updating my Bedroom Project photos. That's what I was doing right before the virus hit. And here's Val in her room 2 years ago. And then here's Val 2 years later. And so I consider the Bedroom Project to just be an ongoing project, which I didn't know when I started. I didn't know my projects were all going to overlap. So I started with 4 women who were coming out of prison. And then I have now 22 women in the Bedroom Project. But then I also photographed women inside prison. And here's just several of the women that I photographed inside prison, all around the prison. And then here is 2 women, Leah, who is in prison, and now you see her in her bedroom. which is really kind of exciting because when I photographed these women, I didn't know they were going to get out. And here's Judy, who is my client that I mentioned that I started out my project with called Spirit on the Inside. Remember I said I started out photographing because I was trying to figure out a way to humanize her. So anyway, the happy ending to that story is the governor actually did give her clemency 2 years ago. And then she was denied parole once, as most people are. And then she was let out of prison. And so now she also has joined my Bedroom Project series. So that's my work. And I hope you learned something about the system and art as advocacy and sort of how life takes all these kind of interesting turns. So after I had done the Life After Life in Prison project, I had actually taken that to a portfolio review session at the Bronx Documentary Center, which was incredibly helpful and incredibly nerve-wracking the first time I went there because I had actually never shown my work to anybody. This photo of Tracy and the next one of Carol are the ones that I showed to the editor at the New York Times. And then after I used my flash, now you can see here's another photo of Carol, which is so much better, and another one of Tracy. And sometimes it just makes me feel really good to be able to go back and say, oh, I actually have progressed a lot over the years that I've been taking these photos. So pretty much every single room I photographed in was really teeny. And so if you look at my photos, a lot of them, the setup is basically the same, and that's not because, it's because I didn't have any choices. The bed maybe took up almost the whole space. I could stand back maybe 2 or 3 feet. I use a wide angle, so I have to be careful about the edges. I don't mess with anything. Like the bedroom is the way that I find it. And the lighting, I mean, as I said originally, I didn't use a flash, but now I use an on-camera flash. A lot of times, if I can, I turn off the overhead light just because it's too harsh and ask people to open up their shades. I try to always photograph during the daytime, so there's as much natural light as possible. And I try to use as little flash as possible. And I'm not sure if it's because I'm a little still afraid of the flash, and so I'm worried about having too much flash, or I think also I just have a look now, and I think my look originally came out of that fear, and now it's just a look that I have, and I want my work to be very consistent, and I like the way it looks, and so that's kind of how I do it. So I think I talked a little bit earlier about what kind of writing prompts I gave, but basically it was just always the same. When you see this photo, what does it make you feel, or what do you think? So very open-ended. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to get as wide of spectrum as possible. So in my first work, Life After Life in Prison, I was actually trying to get to issues in the criminal justice system. But in the Bedroom Project, I was trying to get at people's personal feelings. I wanted to know more about them. And so I guess the kind of questions I would ask you to think about or ask are also very open-ended. So sometimes I think things like, how do you feel? What did this make you think? How long have you been here? Where did you live before? What's special about this place? Do you have anything in this place that's meaningful to you? Those kinds of things, I think, will prompt not only what you're photographing, but how you view your space. Where do you feel most comfortable? How do you set up for bed? Is your room different during the day and the nighttime? Do you share this space? Is it your own? Those kind of questions. Well, one of the things is the problem I have of photographing objects or things, because they're very personal. And so I think for me during this time period, now that I think about it, those are the things I should be photographing around my own house and looking at the things that are meaningful to me, because I find that difficult. And I'm not really sure why, because it's easy for me to talk about my work or for me to reveal something about somebody else's work or their personality. But I guess it's objects, and maybe I'm kind of a minimalist. And so I don't keep that many things around. And so the things that I have are very meaningful to me. And so they feel very personal and revealing. And so maybe that's something that you can think about for yourselves, and which is, I mean, somebody else might say, oh, photographing objects is all I love to do. And I would find photographing a person difficult. So I think we all work within our comfort zone, and you have to find your own comfort zone and then try to stretch and move beyond it. So that's my work. It started out called Life After Life in Prison, but then I have people in prison, and these days I'm sort of thinking as an inside and outside project, and everything is all intertwined, and there's really nothing that's going to give me more pleasure than adding all of the women from the inside to my bedroom project. And I'm in correspondence with many of them, and they're always like, oh, maybe I'm going to come out soon. And I'm like, great, and you can join my bedroom project. So anyway, thanks so much. It was really great to be able to share my project with you, and have fun doing your own photographing.